Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely not wrong. It's like the
All right, let's go ahead and get started. How's everybody doing? Hanging in there? You got this week and then Thanksgiving break, which I think some of you are planning to do your projects during, so don't forget about those. And also for those who aren't doing the Water, Your Life projects, papers coming up due December 5th. I'm going to make a little Canvas place where you can submit your project and papers. But yeah, just a reminder that's coming up. The class after Thanksgiving will be doing just kind of a general discussion, like all that we've heard about the South Platte River Basin. You know, what are your takeaways and what do you think the challenges are? What do you think the opportunities are? And just kind of a summary discussion. There will be no presentations. And then December 5th is when you all will be giving short presentation, probably no more than like 5 minutes because we've got a lot of students in the class, but I'll send more information about what that's supposed to look like before, way in advance. Any questions or things going on, announcements? Okay. Well, I am very excited today to introduce, we've got two speakers. Our theme is environmental justice. Our first speaker, Tom Romero, Dr. Tom Romero. He's the director of the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality at the University of Denver. He is also an associate professor of law and is affiliated faculty with the Department of History at DU. He's the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and essays, and one of the nation's leading experts on legal, social, and political history of race relations in Colorado and the larger Rocky Mountain West. His work recently has focused on the relationship of this history to current challenges around water rights. Dr. Romero is also the principal investigator for National Endowment for the Humanities curricular project documenting histories of racial activism in the Rocky Mountain West as ways to activate and energize today's youth. He received his PhD and JD from the University of Michigan and is an undergraduate alum from the University of Denver. So welcome, Dr. Romero, and I'll just introduce Paul too, and we'll do it all at the beginning. So Paul Hellman, he is the principal of El Laboratorio. He brings decades of professional experience developing innovative conservation and community planning solutions in the Western United States and Latin America. Paul, who was born and raised in the Republic of Panama, brings together diverse people and expertise to solve complex conservation problems, especially those involving underserved communities. He has co-authored 2 books, Designing Greenways, Sustainable Landscapes for Nature and People, and the award-winning Ecology of Greenways in 1993. For 10 years, he was president and professor at the Conway Design School. Paul was educated at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and at Colorado State University. He has expertise in environmental justice, green infrastructure, greenway planning, conservation planning, ecological design, green urbanism, process facilitation, and informal STEM learning. So I'm very excited to have these 2 experts here today to talk with us about environmental justice on the South Platte River and share their expertise and knowledge with us. So let's give a round of applause.
Thank you, Karen, and hello to all of you that are online, and hello to all of you that are in person. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. I want to thank the center for inviting me up, and Karen and the entire team for for facilitating this visit to be here in person. I just came out of earlier today teaching my water law class, and we were talking about and helping my students sort of understand the long history of Indigenous water rights. And so obviously kind of want to start out here sort of thinking obviously about the Ute, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the 48 other Indigenous tribes that have called to this place that we are now standing on home over millennia and centuries. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous privilege that I certainly have, and I think that all of us have, to be here to share ideas, to think of concepts. All those people that keep these classrooms clean, that empty the waste paper baskets, that make the manicure, that keep these beautifully manicured grounds up here, just give us the opportunity to sit here and to share this space. So I am going to have a pretty robust slide deck for you all. I have shared already that with the PDF, so that can be sent out. And so I'm going to move through a lot of these slides really quickly. I start out here to kind of position myself in a variety of ways. I was born and raised here in Colorado. My family goes back 8 generations to what we now call New Mexico and southern Colorado. For my dad's side of the family, we like to talk about the fact that the border crossed us and we didn't cross the border. On mom's side of the family might be a more familiar narrative and story that you all might have heard of with the Latinx community. My maternal grandparents were fleeing the Mexican Revolution, and they ended up in the 1920s settling in Olathe, Colorado. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with Platte, Colorado. It's on the western slope of Colorado. It's about 50 miles south of Grand Junction. And some of you might be familiar with it with Olathe Sweetcorn. And it was on that family farm in the irrigation ditches where I learned how to swim when I would spend my summers on the farm. And I began to think and to hear about the stories and the importance of water, certainly in my own life and my own family. About 10 years ago, I wrote an article that was in the Denver University, Denver Law School Water Law Review. And in that, I was playing around and toying with some ideas. And what I really wanted to do was to get water law, water policy practitioners in conversations with people like myself, people who have a background and studied, consider myself an early practitioner of critical race theory, which I learned and participated in on the University of Michigan campus back in the mid to late 1990s. Trained as a race and ethnic studies historian, also at the University of Michigan. But of course, growing up here, that was my history, right? That was my family. And so, so as a critical race theorist, one of the things I wanted to do was to sort of think about how we can engage people in ways that are both familiar and disruptive. And so I thought of the brown buffalo. And if anybody is familiar with Oscar Zeta Acosta, you would know that he was one of the primary lawyer of the Chicano movement, right? He represented Coach Gonzalez in a variety of different settings in the late 1960s, early 1970s. He was a gonzo journalist, ran with Hunter S. Thompson, if you've heard of gonzo journalism. But in particular was really started negotiating his identity, right, as a Mexican American, as a Chicano, as a brown buffalo, right, as a disruptor, right, of thinking about the structural ways in which race and racism happens in the United States. And so I was thinking of the brown buffalo, but of course, as a person who has practiced water law, who writes about water law, who teaches about water law, particularly here in Colorado, we have this term for who we sort of identify as the most powerful water people in the state. And these are the water buffaloes, right? They are your most powerful lawyers. They're your most powerful policymakers. The settlement of at least the modern West, right, in Colorado in particular, according to them, would not have happened, right, without these water buffaloes. So I'm using the buffalo, right, my own positionality, right, my own family, my own background and training, right, to interrogate and disrupt these water buffaloes. And so that's really kind of the frame in which I'm coming at you here today. The second, I guess, thing I would talk about is I, of course, am trained as a historian as I'm trained as a lawyer. And so what you're going to get from me today is a lot of history. But when I talk about water law with my students, and these are these are the lawyers that are going to be implementing and operationalizing the future of water law. I say we have three primary goals in terms of water law. One is certainty, right? We want to sort of make water available, right, and be certain in our rights to it. We also hope to achieve equity as part of our water law system. And what do I mean by that? Well, most importantly, it means that equity does not mean equality, but sort of understanding that water and water use and water access is different depending upon the needs, depending upon the space, depending upon the location. The final one is justice. And justice is in some ways connects, right, all three together. So our goals are for water law and policy are certainty, equity, and justice. Having the perspective of a brown buffalo, right? Having the perspective of institutional and systemic racism, right? Helps us sort of begin to tie all of these pieces together. So I'm very thankful and reflective on this, as I mentioned, as I came out of talking about Indigenous water rights today in my water law class, and of course, unpackaging and dealing a long history of federal colonialism, right, genocide, and destruction, and certainly the movement of Indigenous peoples onto tiny reservations with ostensibly a lot of water rights that are uncertain and insecure. So in my remaining time here, I'm going to walk us through kind of three big pieces. I want to talk about the ways of which the color line, and I'll talk more about what that means, operates in water law and policy. And I then want to unpackage what that means in context of both Colorado, but of course Denver, the Denver metropolitan area, and the South Platte in particular sorts of ways. And then what I want to finish off with is to talk a little bit about what this looks like, what this history looks like as a matter of both law and policy, and to give you all some ideas and maybe some new tools that you can all sort of take forward as you start thinking about what water justice means and how we operationalize it. All right, part one. This is an image that many of you are probably familiar with and have seen, right? As you start thinking about what water justice looks like in the United States. What we know, right, and certainly those of us that have been sort of following water justice issues knew that there was a problem, right, with the quality of water that Flint was receiving, particularly when they shifted and they changed their water portfolio. So this is the water rights. This is the water rights that I teach, right? From getting their water, which was fairly good, fairly clean from Detroit, Michigan, and moving their water portfolio to Flint, Michigan, right, to the Flint River in particular, which is pretty dirty water, right? And then, of course, a variety of different actions that ultimately resulted in sort of massive institutional and systemic racism, right, against a largely Black community in Flint, Michigan, in which they did not have access to good water, right? And this water was actually making people sick. And certainly, a strong case to be made, it was killing people, right? So this is kind of our prototypical example in terms of how we think about water justice and what it looks like. As I begin to sort of unpackage this, I want to sort of share with you a couple sorts of conceptions about how I'm going to be thinking about this, right? So we start thinking about racism, institutional and systemic racism. I want us to think about race as really kind of a social construct. And this is hopefully not new for many of you, right? But it's based upon a whole bunch of ideas, attitudes, right? Identity, ideology. And what I put up here, most importantly, power. How is racism and race and these racial ideas made real? Through law And that's what I talk about in terms of the color line, right? Law gives these sorts of differences, right, power. So you really need to be thinking about the color line and the importance of law, and as you sort of begin to unpackage what racial or sort of water justice looks like. I also want to put up here something that we certainly struggle with here in Colorado, but I would say certainly throughout the United States and even around the world, right? How and in what ways we sort of think about this in very conscious ways and begin to unpackage this in very conscious ways, or ways we choose to ignore it, right? And become blind to what this means. And sometimes that blindness happens as a result of sort of not just legal policy and practice, but done so in ways so we don't even have to sort of think about it, right, on an everyday basis. And so I'll unpackage for us what that means here in sort of actual practice. So my larger argument here today, right, is that access to water is built upon a Jim Crow system, right? Our water infrastructure, right, reflects deliberate prejudice against communities of color on the basis of race. So the article that I wrote 10 years ago, a decade ago now, right, used this example that happened in Zanesville, Ohio. And it was a case that made it to court. And this comes actually from the exhibits in the case. And what you see up here in particular is exactly what I'm talking about. You have a city, right, whose water infrastructure reflects the color line, right, where those that are getting good, clean, consistent, certain water, right, are largely the white residents. And the Black Coal Run neighborhood has no access to water infrastructure, right? How do they get their water? Through rainwater capture, which is largely illegal out here in Colorado, right? I don't know if anybody knows that. But that's the only way you could get water, right, in the Black neighborhood is by capturing rainwater, and then of course having to filter it, boil it, right, and of course necessarily being certain about having a particular amount to have here, right. So this is, I think, a perfect demonstration of what this sort of water injustice looks like. This just Jim Crow system that I've talked about. Of course, it's been documented repeatedly all across the United States, right? Flint, Michigan is just a very small tip of a very, very large iceberg that exists all over the United States, right? Not just in particular areas, but in the South, in the border, right? In the Northeast, and here in Colorado, right? So I want to begin to then unpackage a little bit of how this history has manifested itself in Colorado. How many people are familiar with the sign? Yeah. When you look at the sign, and I'll repeat this for the people online, what images come to mind? And just blurt them out. Go ahead. Fields full of flowers, right? What else? Mountains, purple mountains majesty, right? What else? Sunsets, orange sunsets, right? What do they say if you're a Denver Bronco fan? That God must be a Bronco fan because of those orange sunsets, right? You believe in God, right? So amber fields of grain, red rocks, right? Blue spruces, right? Nobody said people, right? Nobody said people up here. So I don't think I have it in the slide. Actually, I think I pulled it out of this slide. But one of the things I want you to begin to think about is how you can begin to think about people, right, within these landscapes. And of course, and most importantly, right, the people in these landscapes, right, the law has created and contributed, right, to a powerful color line that has kept these landscapes, right, literally divided by color, right? And so we have in our history in Colorado, right, the largest anti-Chinese riot to occur between the coasts in the late 19th century. This happened in Denver, right? So anti-Chinese bias, leading to, of course, a legal system, right, that denied not just entry to the Chinese, but citizenship rights to them as well, right? As well as Japanese later in the 19th and early 20th century. During the 1920s, Some of you might know and be familiar with the fact that Colorado was ground zero for the Ku Klux Klan. For a 2-year period, the governor of Colorado was a member of the Klan. One of the United States federal senators was a member of the Klan. A majority of the state house were members of the Klan. Local government were Klan's members. School board members were Klan members, right? So there was this moment in which Colorado and cities throughout the state were captured, right, by this long history, right, of not just anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment, right, that was at the center of Klan power. During the 1930s, in only the second time that the governor of Colorado used his power, martial law was declared and troops were sent to the border. Now, what border do you think I'm talking about? New Mexico. Why? To keep Mexicans, and in reality, largely Mexican Americans, who had actually been coming from southern Colorado, from northern New Mexico, from Texas, to work as part of a seasonal and annual migratory stream of farm workers in the sugar beet fields in northeastern Colorado, not far from here, right? But of course, during the 1930s and during the Great Depression, Mexicans in particular were scapegoated, right, for many of the challenges that were happening to people during the Great Depression. And of course, things like this, postings, right, to hunt and track down Mexican Americans were posted all over the place. You had the newspapers, if you look at the images, showing the National Guard arming themselves to go to the border. You had maps that were appearing in newspapers, right? They were all along the border of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, right? So I don't know if you knew Colorado was a international boundary, right? Didn't, but of course, sort of highlighted the anti-Mexican sentiment that existed at the time. All throughout Colorado, right? Property ownership and neighborhoods were kept racially segregated by racially restrictive covenants. In the 1930s, the governor of Colorado, or the Colorado Supreme Court, declared it was the public policy of the state of Colorado to keep neighborhoods racially segregated, right? So this sort of language is appearing in people's title deed. Here in the Denver area, and as we get to start talking about the South Platte, which cuts through, right, Denver here, you see, right, the impact of these covenants, right? They're designed to keep neighborhoods segregated and to contain where you have large concentrations of people of color, largely Latinx, largely Black community in Denver. Of course, reinforced by federal policy and private acts. These are the redlining maps. That 256 of these were created for cities all across the United States. And again, you kind of see the Platte River kind of cutting through here, right? So we're talking about some of the implications of that here. We start talking about water. So I think this is a map that many of you are familiar with, right? It's one that shows that 80% of the water is on the western slope of the Front Range, 80% of the people, right, or 80% of the people are the Front Range, 80% of the water is on the western slope, right? So early on, a city like Denver in particular was very active in beginning to secure water rights that were all the way over here, right, and move them under the Continental Divide, right, to the Denver metropolitan area. And Denver was one of the most active for that. You see some of the water infrastructure that was built, Dillon Reservoir. Anyone that's drove down I-70, right, is familiar with really what is Denver water, right? And water that ended up providing about 65% of the water supply to those that are living in the Denver metropolitan area. So I want to sort of walk through some of these really quickly and just sort of imagine. I have one of my postdoctoral fellows through iRise is here, who's a geographer. So I apologize to her with my poor map making abilities, because I wish I could do this like a true geographer. But sort of imagine all these maps beginning to lay over one another. And I just want to sort of highlight here this piece here. As you're looking at all of these maps, and ultimately kind of going back here to the water infrastructure. What we see, particularly into the 1960s in a place like Denver and along the Platte River, is that the ones that had either the oldest or most non-existent water infrastructure were the Black and Latinx neighborhoods, right? So this is a perfect example. What is a indicator of substandard dwelling units? Having a lack of access to clean water and to right? So we see this beginning to happen in Colorado and Denver in particular. A couple of things tied to this history that I think is really important. In the 1950s, in particular, Denver realizes that they don't have enough water, right, to meet the needs of of the demand for the growing Denver metropolitan area. So they establish in 1953 this thing called the Blue Line, right? And this blue line here means that they're not going to basically deliver or get into any contracts with anyone that exists outside the blue line of this, basically the jurisdictional boundaries of the city and county of Denver. Now in the 50s, you can imagine Denver's growing. There's a lot of growth in the suburbs. Well, you get a lot of developers that are begging Denver Water, right, to bring them into the system. And Denver says the only way we can bring you into the system, right, beyond this blue line is if we annex you. And the Planning Commission said we can't annex you because we don't have enough water, a water supply, right, to make this happen. So why might others as well also want to sort of ask to be part of the Denver water supply? Well, if you look to the northeast of Denver, right, what we call this Commerce City neighborhood, we also had some other issues that were happening, right, in terms of the quality of the water that was that was available. So during the 1950s, particularly, and here's the South Platte, and then as you go here along 270, which is a tributary of the South Platte, which is the Sand Creek, you get the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is online. At the time, they were making mustard gas, right? You also get along what becomes 270, a lot of petroleums and refineries. And so what does this mean for the people that are living there? Well, bad water, right? Toxic water, right? That of course manifests itself in a lot of ways. The arsenal creating a whole bunch of pollution, the refineries, right? Basically just pouring gasoline, right, into irrigation ditches, right? This is the water that people had available, right? And continued to sort of be challenged by. So what does this mean ultimately, kind of as we're sort of thinking about kind of water and the politics of water and water law and policy? Well, a couple things happen into the 1960s. First, the issue of school desegregation becomes really prominent in the city and county of Denver, right? At the same time that Dillon Reservoir comes online and the blue lines rescinded by the Denver Water Department. So now Denver Water Department is beginning to establish contracts with some of this growth that's happening out here. They're not doing too much up here in Commerce City, but there's a lot of things that are happening here. So in the 1960s, a lot of these suburban municipalities, which are largely white, they're no longer begging Denver to necessarily annex, right? Because Denver Water is engaging in contracts with them. But one of the things that begins to happen is ultimately Denver public schools are found to be segregated. There's a case that makes its way to the United States Supreme Court that confirms this fact, right? And one of the ways in which you can sort of begin to respond to segregation is for Denver to start annexing a lot of those places on its periphery, right? So what is the response to that, right? And how does water sort of play a part in this? You see here, right, Denver Water is having a huge influence. And this influence is all based upon water, right? It's all based upon water. But then Colorado voters changed the Constitution to do two things. One, to prevent busing, unless it's under a court order. And two, to prevent the city and county of Denver from growing by annexation. It became much harder for the city to do that. So, quick question, before I get to the third part of my talk here, is why would voters across the state care about Denver annexing, parts of the city, right, on its periphery, coming into Douglas County, coming into Jefferson County? Well, it's back to this, because guess what? As Denver grows, they need more water over here, right? So the politics of school desegregation, the politics of water come together, right, within the Poundstone Amendment, right, to really sort of minimize and sort of minimize integration and solidify what had been historic segregation, right? That of course continues to exist to this very day, right? It's sort of ossified what we see, right, as the historic and traditional patterns of racial segregation that exist in the city. All right, so let me tie off my talk here in the last couple of minutes. So what are some tools to sort of think about this history, right? Well, first of all, and this is still somewhat, I'm not certain how good of a law this is anymore, but this came out of the affirmative action cases involving the University of Michigan in 2003, right? Where Justice Andrew Day O'Connor said that race still matters in the United States, right? And we need to be mindful of that fact. So as we're thinking about water justice in particular, there are a variety of different tools, right? There are tools that exist in federal law, there are tools that exist in state law. There are also, and what I would suggest, really important tools that exist at the local level. So let me talk about, in particular, one that exists at the state level and one that exists at the local level that I would certainly encourage you to think about, right? And think about how these laws, these policies can influence and connect to this larger history. One is the Colorado's Environmental Justice Act, which, and one of the kind of most important things that is done is help to identify where Colorado's disproportionately impacted communities are, right? And a lot of times that is measured and tracks, right, with racial segregation, right, with the color line. So here's a map that I pulled about a year and a half ago. And you can see, right, all of the areas, right, that are disproportionately impacted. But what happens when you overlay a water basin map over it? It shows that there's disproportionately impacted communities, right, in every water basin, including the South Platte, right? And in particular, concentrated, all along the South Platte, right, from Denver all the way to Greeley. So I think that's going to be a really important law and act, right, to help us think about and get good data. The second thing I want to sort of have you think about, this is something I've been writing about, is encouraging your local water utilities to become color conscious, right? And you can do so by having these things called racial impact statements. And they come out of the criminal justice world. You have states like Iowa, Connecticut, Florida, Oregon, and New Jersey that actually use them as part of their legislative process. When they're looking at legislation, when they're looking at policy, to really have a report to sort of detail how this might impact, what might be the impact of these policies in terms of racial disparities and other sort of social disparities. And so kind of come back here and to look, right, what might a racial impact statement look like in a place like Commerce City, right? One that has the history of chemical contamination from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, the ongoing contamination that happens as a result of the petroleum refineries with Suncor. And of course, what has emerged, right, in the last 30 years as high concentrations of people of color, largely Latinx communities, right, that are in close proximity to some of the kind of most toxic, right, water and polluted water that we have. And of course, encouraging water utility like South Water Adams, whose water supply and water portfolio, and this ties back to Flint, Michigan, is largely based upon these tributary wells, right? And the only way that they can get good water is they have to buy water from Denver Water, right? In particular, to dilute the amount of water. So as a water utility begins to sort of think of their water portfolio, what would a racial impact statement do, right? Sort of think about exactly these pieces of this larger history of institutional and systemic racism. So a couple issues to keep in mind, right? The history that I detailed is still ongoing and we're still living with it. As many of you, and as part of thinking about water justice, more precisely, working with disproportionately impacted communities means there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and talent and creative ideas in those communities. You'll hear about some of that in the next presentation, right? So these aren't deficit-based communities. They're actually communities that are rich in cultural tradition and understanding of how water works and what solutions would look like. And of course, certainly this is all community-based, right? Community-led. And I have a project that's called the Color of Water Project that is working on the South Platte with an organization called Cultivando and others that are really trying to begin to unpackage and to get data around the larger history and some of the solutions around these issues. So let me stop here and I put this image up here. Going back to the concept of justice. And when you think about justice, right, water is always literally, right, in our conception of what that looks like. So certainly that is kind of what we're working towards, right, in terms of our water law and our water work. So I don't know if there's time for questions. I went slightly over my time and I want to turn it over to Paul, but thank you all.
That giving grace and rental and really hard. Do you have any anecdotal experience like that or thoughts on how that's been?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I started here is the history, right? I think, and particularly if we look at along the South Platte and myself as a historian, so much of this history is in people's minds, right? But it's yet to be documented. It's yet to be excavated, right? So I think that's one of the ways in which the case is going to be made, is getting into the archives. It's a lot of oral histories to be made. It's collaborating as well. I think about this in two ways. One, we go back to that case I told you about, the school desegregation case that happened in Denver. Well, what was really interesting about that case is there was actually a mathematician at the University of Denver, a guy by the name of George Bardwell. This is pre like GIS, but he took all this census data, he took all of this school attendance data and began to historically churn that through, right? To really document what was really kind of ongoing year by year racism, right? And the way that the school district was directly responding and changing school attendance boundaries in relation to that racism. I think we could do something, and I think there's a history there kind of around water utilities, right? And I know, for myself that Denver Water has been a really, they have an archive, they have a library, and they've been very great about opening their archive to some of these questions. On other water utilities, I think it's still relationship building that needs to happen, I think, in that sense. So the other piece that I would also say here too, and we're seeing this in California, but I think there's another history of activism, that's taking place here. And I always sort of think of an interesting counterfactual. And you heard I have a project that's connected to the Chicano movement and the history of the Chicano movement that took place here in Colorado in the 1960s and 1970s. And I always wondered, as this counterfactual, what would have happened if these Chicano activists and these Black Power activists, instead of maybe protesting the school board or protesting the police department, had actually started to protest the water department. and actually began to seize power on the water boards. And I say that we're seeing actually that happening as a strategy, maybe beyond a legal strategy, but a political strategy in places like California, in particular, right? And I know you had a session on water governance. I think that is kind of a real interesting place to think about, where power, can be seized, and where you can start getting some of this color consciousness, right, to be built into the work of the water utility. So please email me too, and happy to answer them. And Paul, thank you for. You do. I don't know what time to do that, so if you can either scan that or. You just share. Turn all the lights on?
Yeah.
Yes. For the people online, could we give them in the chat this?
Yeah, if you give that to me, I'll type it
Okay.
into the chat.
Oh, you can do it.
Okay, let me just close this. Actually, just turn that off. There you go. Okay.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you, and what a great lead into a very practical kind of applied sense of what we can do to break down some of those barriers where, especially young people in the communities that consistently showed up along the river that Tom was showing us, how they relate to the river and water in general. So let me just tell you about the handout. You'll find there's a little survey. It's actually just a box, a Google survey, and then several documents that you may find interesting to look at. There's a specific reason we'd like you to use that survey box to answer this question. And this is on behalf of CSU and other students who are looking at the South Platte River and eager to find ways to make connections to resources, especially at CSU. So their question is, can you recommend people, programs, or other resources that might make good allies for youth who want to improve the South Platte River through Denver? And the thinking is CSU is an incredible land grant university and institution. And so there's tremendous resources here. So we have young people who are trying to tap into more of those resources than historically have been available to them. So the story I want to tell tonight, and I usually use pictures because I'm trained as a designer, but I thought in the interest of time, just have a few minutes really with you. I'd just concentrate on telling a story of what has been a pretty interesting evolution of opportunities that really began about 7 years ago. There was a conversation really facilitated by the Colorado Water Center. A group of DACA students were brought together. Basically, a friend of mine was at the Colorado Water Center, Mary Lou Smith, and she grew up in northern New Mexico. I grew up in Central America, and we just thought, okay, I was focused on sustainability, she on water, that there had to be ways to make greater opportunities for people coming from a Latino or other non-mainstream kind of traditions to be engaged with water and sustainability. So we started what became the Colorado Water Fellows Program. I know a couple of you at least know what that's about. And it wasn't just that we wanted to impose or fill them with our notions of water issues and what was important, but instead it was as Tom hinted at, not to see them as in a deficit situation, but to see them as something to contribute to this conversation, to add to the diversity of perspectives on water and such. And very quickly, they focused on, although they were from different places in Colorado, they started to focus on the South Platte River and those same neighborhoods that Tom was speaking of. And what they learned there was these are neighborhoods with low percentage of tree canopy. In other words, not a lot of trees, history of flooding, the kind of water quality, drinking water issues that Tom mentioned, as well as the river itself had really significant biological contaminants. And so the youth that were participating in our kind of a class started to develop what they were called river festivals that took place in the summer in those neighborhoods to engage with the community about water and water issues. It was interesting to see that often there were people in those neighborhoods, youth in particular, who had no relationship with the river, or if they had any perception of the river, it wasn't necessarily a positive one. The river was a place where drug users were found, and who knows La Llorona? Do you know La Llorona, anybody? Okay, so it was a place to be fearful of. It wasn't something to celebrate or to really enjoy. And so it wasn't a matter of just going to youth and saying, what should the river become? But it was to work to help them as young people understand this incredible resource that's right in their community. But early on, it became obvious, as I talked to Mary Lou about bringing in people that might look a little bit more like the students to be speakers, experts on issues of water. She was dumbstruck to think of many folks. And it was only as I was watching a documentary on the Colorado River that I learned of somebody who then became a main player in our activities, a Puerto Rican lawyer who primarily worked in the water arena, a friend of Tom's. The other thing we noticed was that there was a suspicion of many, or at least some of the water river-focused agencies. There was a sense that they couldn't be trusted. And so there was this kind of disconnect between the people who worked for organizations that were responsible for improving the quality of the water in the river, who couldn't exactly relate to these youth and these communities. And that's where it really struck us that that young people in those communities and the people we worked with here in the Water Fellows program at CSU, they were a resource. They had language and cultural sensitivity that allowed them to interact with those neighborhoods in ways that many of the agencies were not really capable of. One summer, wasn't the Water Fellows program, but it was another program. Anyone know the Upward Bound program? It's a program that allows first generation to college students to interact in all kinds of great ways through their high school years. And so we helped structure a program for a group of those students from Denver, looking at the South Platte River, talking to river experts, talking to community activists and others about the river. And their charge was, what can young people do? What should we do after you've spent these months in the summer learning about the river? And they said there needs to be what has come to be called the South Platte River Advisory Youth Council. And what we want to do, we want to advise agencies and other organizations on how they can more effectively and equitably interact with our communities. And then they did something pretty brassy. They appointed themselves the first such council. And so that was the start of something that survives today. That group is actually meeting at CSU. Not that group, but the Spray Council is here at CSU. There are 7 students who are part of a larger council. And those are the ones who want you, and I'd like to invite you to type something into that survey form about resources that might be available that you know of, people that you know of, programs, whatever, at CSU that these members of the South Platte River Advisory Youth Council might connect with and find potential allies. So type in anything you can think of that would help greatly as they start to research those connections to further the efforts of this group of young people. That group, it's gone through different iterations, but one year it was during the pandemic. They did something pretty also brassy, which was they invited different agencies, these same kind of agencies we're talking about that are charged with engaging with the community on behalf of the river. And they invited those agencies to make pitches for activities, tasks, projects that would engage youth and communities on behalf of the river. And so they, instead of the other way around where the agencies would come to youth and say, well, we've got a program for you and we want you to do this. And, we'll be learning about monitoring water quality, or we'll learn about pulling invasive species out of the riparian buffer, whatever. But they flip things on their head, and they ask the agencies to come and make presentations. And then the youth involved in that program were able to select the kinds of activities that they thought would be meaningful to young people in these neighborhoods. And for 2 summers, those activities were tested and they're continuing on. Another thing I wanted to invite you to suggest yourself or somebody else you know at the university is that on October 12th, 2024, at the CSU Spur campus, there will be a youth river summit to which young people who are really engaged about the South Platte River through the metropolitan area are coming together to talk not just about what they're doing, but some of these activities that they've been testing, and to have a conversation from a youth perspective. What do people want to think about as far as the future of the South Platte River? So there are lots of things that are beginning to happen around these youth activities, and it just seems like the reason CSU is really where it was a seminal kind of time when these ideas started to evolve, and there's so many more resources now. The work has primarily been focused on water quality, mostly on non-point source pollution, mostly biological contaminants. The reason it's mostly focused on those things so far is that that's where the funding has come from. But it's a much bigger issue. There's so many aspects of the river as the river through the metropolitan area, as the visible, the visible expression of water in people's lives that has not been, an immediate kind of relationship that's developed for so many people. So, in conclusion, there are a couple things that we've concluded about this effort so far. It's a nascent effort. There's lots more to happen. But not only is the river this visual element potentially right in the community, but it's also it's something that once youth have an opportunity to experience, to understand the potential, that they are rallying around. One young 8th grader wrote to me and said, we kids, we demand a fishable and swimmable South Platte River, and we're ready to work. And it's that kind of enthusiasm and commitment that we're sensing more and more as people come to understand what the river is and what it can be in their lives. The other thing we've seen is that working on real projects that matter. So there's so many kind of things in education, we all know about this, where it's all about hypothetical and you're learning, in a sort of remote kind of way. But when you do hands-on work, not only do you plant the tree in the riparian buffer of the river, but you learn about the impact of riparian vegetation, you learn about watershed issues. It all ties together so easily and so beautifully that there's so much more of this kind of possibility. And in our work going forward, we'll be engaging with experts in informal STEM learning, as well as experts in cultural awareness and other aspects to make more robust these kind of activities that agencies need to do, want to do, but they need some help. And so it's not just about what can we do for youth, it's like what can youth do for agencies to make all of this much more effective, much more equitable. And always reminding ourselves that we're all participants, and no matter how young you are, I always think of the sculpture over by the chemistry building, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We all have a contribution. We build on what other people have done. Whether you're young, old, or in between, there's something important that you can contribute. So what I'd like you to contribute to right now is just to put some thought and send it in to us through that Google form, so that we can uncover more opportunities for young people who want to see an enhanced South Platte River through Denver. Thank you.
Question for Paul? Talking about power shifting, you mentioned a couple of awesome successes. Are the youth aware of like the dynamics of what's going on? Are they interested in shifting their power more towards like intergenerationally?
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting that there's still, because of some of their leadership who are from those communities, they're still very suspicious of the people who are exerting power. So they don't automatically go, oh, you're from the government, you're here to help us. No, it's really questioning what's being served up to them. Can I just tell you one real life situation, which I think illustrates the potential of all of this? So Diane Moraz is a CSU graduate. I met her a few years ago. I led a trip for first generation college students to Costa Rica, a surface learning project, and got to know her then. She, as an undergrad, not undergrad, as a high school student in Greeley, had participated in the Upward Bound program, first generation college. At CSU, she came in as a bridge scholar, also for first generation. We went to Costa Rica. She was a water fellow in her senior year. I hadn't heard from her for a while, but I just got a LinkedIn announcement of what she was up to. She went on to Johns Hopkins, got a master's in GIS. She's for 2 years been with an international consulting firm. When I talked to Diane about her path through all of that, she said it was actually a rafting trip on Clear Creek above Denver that changed her perspective and made her aware of water and its significance, changed her life. And that's something that we're finding too, that when people don't know the river or suspicious of the river, let's provide opportunities to recreate or whatever it gives you an experience knowing the river. Anything else? Yeah, number two. No,
What's the connection between like this youth-led organization and the river and also farms in the area? Maybe like a small scale and a big scale. Is there one involved?
there's a, if you want to read about a really totally inspiring person, Beverly Grant has an organization, Black Women in Denver has an organization called Mo Betta Green. And you'll see, and those are urban farms. And some of these same youth that are working on water issues are also working on urban food issues. That's the connection there. Yes? Well, thanks so much. And please write us something, help us find some more resources.
Thank you, Paul.